right, ready?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to America House. My name is Yulia Tkachuk. I'm the Deputy Director, and I'm very happy to see you tonight. And it is with a great pleasure I introduce our tonight's speaker, Nolan Peterson. Nolan is the former Special Operations pilot and a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, with multiple degrees in political science, French, and journalism. As a freelance writer, he covers international affairs and national security. He recently wrote a how-to guide for journalists, how to cover the military. And of course, he is very well published. He is also a traveler. He traveled all the 7 continents and visited over 40 countries. In June, Nolan went to Donbass and spent about a week in the military zone and did the reporting on the war in the East. And what strikes me personally in Nolan's reporting is the sunlight. His photos from the war have a lot of sunlight. And I'm pretty sure that Nolan's experience of the war in Donbass is not only about the sunlight, it's about rain, hail, and heavy storms. So with no further ado, I'm giving the floor to Nolan to share his experiences.
Well, thank you for the nice introduction. It's an honor to be here tonight, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share my story with all of you. So what I thought I'd do is start off real quick with just the first few minutes of my video from Pesky, just to give you a sense of what I saw and what it was like out there. So I'll give about 5 minutes of this, and I'll go into my talk.
Лучше по обочине.
Can you talk a little bit slower for the interpreter to catch up?
Okay, no problem.
I am 19 years old. I am 2 months here.
Okay. So you've been in the ATO for 2 months.
Yes.
Yeah. What's been your impression? Has it been what you expected it to be?
I know where I go. I know what I see here. I know, but last moments, I want to go home just for a bit, just for a week.
Do you get tired of the battles?
Physically, no, but moral, I'm tired, very tired.
It seems like the shooting is pretty much non-stop. Is that kind of drain your energy after a while?
Yes. This yesterday was artillery tanks shoot our positions. It was there from Zhabich. It's not too far from here. There were tank. And these moments, they're too hard.
Do you feel like after being on the front for a few months that you're less afraid now? Do you feel like after being in the ATO now for a few months that you feel less fear during the battles?
Less fear. 2 months ago, I have no fear when shooting, the bullets flying over me. But now I'm see, down. It is the DNR army shooting at us. The separatist Russian army. It's good. Yeah, we can stay. No.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yes, this is bullets. So this is Pesky.
This is the ceasefire, huh?
Yes, this is it.
This is what the ceasefire looks like. It's
We
been going on like
shooting,
this.
we're not shooting. They shoot us every day.
And it's pretty much been like this since the ceasefire was signed.
Yes.
So I think I'll leave it there for right now. But if you want, you can watch the whole video. It's posted both on Newsweek and on the Daily Signal. And I think so far it's gotten about 200,000 views. So it is getting some attention. And actually just this afternoon, CNN used some of that footage and did a spot about how the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine is broken down. So the message is definitely getting out and the story has been making some impact. Just for a little bit of context, that opening scene where you saw me running and breathing really hard, that was the first night that I was in Pesky. That was within about an hour of me getting there. So that was my introduction to what life in Pesky was like. And Daniel, the 19-year-old that you saw there at the beginning of the interview, the day I left, he was in a trench and an artillery shell fell in the trench that he was in. He didn't lose any limbs and he wasn't killed, but he was evacuated to a hospital in Dnipropetrovsk, and he had a very serious head injury, and he's still there. But it just shows you the seriousness of the war and how quickly things can turn bad. So, thank you all again for being here. As was mentioned in the introduction, journalism is not my first career. I was a pilot for Air Force Special Operations, and I deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I made the transition to becoming a writer and a journalist after a career as a pilot, I studied those who had came before me and the best writers, I thought, trying to learn my new craft. And one of the writers who had the biggest influence on me was Ernest Hemingway. And one piece of advice Hemingway gave about starting any story is he said to begin with one true sentence, the truest sentence you know. Well, to begin my talk tonight, I thought I'd start with the truest sentence that I know. The war in Ukraine is not over. It's easy to think that it might be. When you walk around Kyiv or Lviv or Dnipropetrovsk, which is hard for me to pronounce, or Kharkiv, or even Mariupol, life is still going on. People are still going out to bars and restaurants. Movies are still being played. Young couples are still getting married. Students are still in school. But I guarantee right now, as I'm talking, there are soldiers trying to kill each other in eastern Ukraine. Admittedly, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a journalist. I have no legal background. But in my mind, when soldiers shoot at each other every day for months on end, when villages are left in ruins and families are left homeless as refugees, unable to return home because the fighting is still too intense, when young men and women are so mentally scarred by the combat they've endured that they feel like they cannot rejoin the lives they've left behind, when you have all that, that's not a ceasefire. That's a war. And it's still going on. So tonight I want to tell you a little bit about my time embedded with the 93rd Brigade in Pesky. This summer, the Ukrainian military decided to allow, for the first time ever, embedded journalists within the regular army. I've been traveling to Ukraine since last August. I've had the chance to go out to the ATO many times, going out with National Guard units or civilian volunteer battalions. But when I heard about the embed program with the regular army, I jumped at the chance. I knew this would be a unique opportunity to get a raw, unfiltered look at the conflict. And I was right. I was ultimately selected for one of the first batches of journalists to go into combat with the regular army. And from June 8th to the 15th, I embedded with the 93rd Brigade in Pesky. On July 8th, 2 French journalists and I boarded the express train here in Kyiv to Konstantinivka. And once we arrived, we got a taxi, which drove us out to a block post just outside Donetsk, where members of the 93rd Brigade picked us up. And one of the most striking things about traveling to the front lines in eastern Ukraine is how close you can get to the war and still see normal life going on uninterrupted. As we approached Pesky, we crossed a bridge going over a lake, and there were about a half a dozen young children swimming. It was just so jarring to see that. It seemed out of place. And we were only a couple miles from the front lines. You could hear the artillery and the guns going off. But that's one of the defining parts of this war, which distinguishes it from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with which I'm most familiar. Ukraine, unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, is not a country at war. The war here in Ukraine is mostly contained to a buffer zone of a couple miles on either side of the front lines. Occasionally, the war will go further and break out of that area, like when you had the Smerch rocket attack in Kramatorsk in February, or when the Grads hit Mariupol in January. But since the February 12th ceasefire and after Debaltseve, the war has been mostly static, locked within that boundary on either side of the front lines. And that, I think, has partially led to the false impression that things are relatively peaceful out there. But the idea that the ceasefire is holding is an illusion. And that fiction was immediately evident when we arrived in Pesky on June 8th, when you saw that opening scene. The village of Pesky is almost completely destroyed. Most buildings have partially caved-in roofs from the artillery. Almost every vertical surface is pockmarked with bullet and shrapnel holes. And in my 8 days there, I didn't see a single window that hadn't been shattered. And the fighting is still ongoing and practically nonstop, creating a constant background din of small arms and artillery fire. At night, you can hear the separatist or the Russian drones orbiting overhead. The soldiers called them Sputniks. In fact, soldiers get nervous if an hour goes by without hearing the sounds of artillery or gunshots. It's that constant. Once we arrived, we met the soldiers with whom we'd be living for the next 8 days. They were a specialized unit comprising mainly reconnaissance soldiers and snipers. And like most units in Pesky, the soldiers lived in the basement of an abandoned house, which is the only refuge from the artillery and snipers. You have to go underground. Inside the basement was this bizarre coexistence of hints of the lives these men left behind to go to war, with evidence of the war. You see cards from children pasted on the wall, hanging next to Kalashnikovs. On bookshelves, you see images of the Orthodox Virgin Mary laying next to grenades. The separatist reconnaissance patrols would go through Pesky at night trying to kill or abduct Ukrainian troops. And so many soldiers would actually sleep with their guns in beds with them for safety. The outhouse, where the toilet was, and the shower were about 100 meters away from the basement. You had to cross a road to get there. And when you're inside either the outhouse or the shower, you see beams of light coming in at different angles from the bullet and the shrapnel holes in the ceiling, or not the ceiling, but the walls and the door. Actually, some of the scariest moments were going out to the outhouse and the shower. You're outside and vulnerable, either naked, taking a shower, or with your pants down. And you're not wearing your body armor or your helmet. And I always had this fear that I'd be taking a shower and the artillery would start and I have to run back naked to the basement. And thankfully for everybody, that never happened. But one of the French journalists was shot at by a sniper 4 times walking to the toilet, underscoring the ever-present danger. The soldiers in Pesky are relatively well supplied with weapons and ammunition. It's mostly surplus stuff from the Soviet Union, usually a couple decades old. And I never heard anybody complain about not having enough weapons or ammo. But everything else, everything is supplied by civilian volunteers. Body armor, uniforms, boots, food, water, first aid kits, sleeping bags, pillows, everything comes from civilian volunteers. And for the soldiers, it's a huge morale boost to see these civilian volunteers showing up with these supplies. It makes them feel like people back home haven't forgotten about them. It is pretty impressive when you see a bullet-ridden minivan slide around the corner with a couple of 60-year-old men driving it to deliver a couple bags of cookies and some water to the soldiers. And based on what I saw, I don't think the Army could hold their positions without the support of the civilian volunteers. They play a critical role in this war. And while we were embedded, we had the chance to go on patrols with the soldiers, to go into the trenches and to see different fighting positions. I had seen the trenches in places like Shirokina, and I've been to other destroyed villages in Ukraine. And like those other times, what I saw in Pesky reminded me of images I had seen about World War I. Obviously, the scale of this conflict is nowhere near battles like the Verdun or the Somme. But the living conditions and the type of long-range, distant warfare are very similar. Many of the soldiers told me they hardly ever see the enemy, yet at night they can hear them talking across no man's land. And I was curious whether there was a humanizing effect after living so close to the enemy for so long. Do you feel like you develop any sort of connection with them that might make it harder to kill them? And in Pesky, the answer was the same that it had been in Shirokina. No. These soldiers have been on the lines for so long, and they've seen so many of their friends killed or wounded in front of them, that they just want to fight. In fact, what most of them told me, as when I asked what the hardest part of being out there was, they didn't say that they wanted to go home. They said they wanted to attack. They wanted to advance. They wanted to take back territory that they thought belonged to Ukraine and had been invaded by Russia. So the will of the Ukrainians to fight is very strong. But they also told me that they can't go on much longer like this, in this static war that they just sit there and they're sitting ducks for the artillery and the snipers. Psychologically, it's a tough war. The hardest part for me, at least, was that you could never escape the danger. Like I mentioned about the outhouse and the toilet, you can die just as easily going out to take a shower as you could in the trenches or going out on patrol. You just never know when the artillery is going to start or when a sniper has you in his scopes. Every second in the back of your mind, you're worrying about dying. And usually your chances of survival just depend on good luck and not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And we had a couple close calls. One time walking back from the trenches with a sniper named Vladimir, a 120 millimeter artillery shell fell on the path we were taking 1 minute behind us. If I had taken a couple extra sips of water before I left or asked one more question in an interview, I probably wouldn't be here. I can't tell you how many times I heard bullets flying overhead, like in the video you saw. In fact, one time the minivan we took to drive around Pesky sometimes, a sniper's bullet went in the front windshield, passing directly between the passenger's seat and the driver's seat. 1 foot left or right and somebody would have died. And near the end of the embed, we had our closest call. There's about 7 of us in a field walking around stupidly without our body armor on. And we clustered together for a brief second, all 7 of us. And we heard a buzzing sound overhead, a drone. We got a little spooked, so we started walking back toward the basement. And as we were walking back, maybe about 10 seconds after we decided to turn around, a tank shot at us. A tank. Like World War II stuff, you know. And tank rounds are harder to react to than artillery because when the tanks shoot, the trajectory is flatter. Artillery mainly, it arcs a little bit more. So the time from hearing the round to it hitting the ground is very short. So we heard this round going off, we heard the swoop of it going over our head, and then it impacted the earth exactly where we had been about 10 seconds before. And I don't know how we lived, but we did. And then we all sprung up and ran as fast as we could in a total panic back to the basement. And the heaviest artillery attack we had while we were out there happened that afternoon. It was terrifying. I'm not too proud to say that. 152 millimeter rounds impacting 2 or 3 times a minute. And we just hid in the cellar, trying to stay safe from the shrapnel. But a direct hit on the house would have been fatal. The ground was shaking. Things were falling off the walls. It was like an earthquake. And during an artillery attack, all you can do is sit there and stare in the eyes of the man across from you and just hope that you're not going to die. You hear the round go off, you hear the whistle of it coming in, and you sit there and you say, please don't hit us. And then you hear it impact outside, and you're alive, and you hope that there's not another one. And then you hear the round go off again, and there's another pulse of adrenaline. You're scared, you live, and it goes on and on and on like that for about an hour, leaving you totally exhausted. But as scary as the artillery was, for me, the snipers were the worst part. Unlike artillery, when a sniper is shooting at you, you know there's a human being looking through a rifle scope, trying to kill you. And it's not about being lucky anymore. It's about being better than the person trying to gun you down. And that is how the soldiers live in Pesky every day. Some of them have been out there for more than 6 months without a single trip home. Every second of every day, they know they can die. They've seen it happen to their friends, and they know it can happen to them too. And so the psychological strain of this war is intense. Many soldiers cope with this by trying to recreate little bits of the lives they left behind out there in the war zone. Nemo, a 38-year-old from Kerch in Crimea, he has a plot of strawberries that he grows in a field. And he built a gym in a destroyed home where he works out with pull-up bars and dip bars, even while their artillery is going off. He's been there for more than 6 months, so he pretty much does not react to the artillery anymore. Bogdan is a 25-year-old from Lviv. He tinkers with a motorcycle every day to remind him of the one that he has waiting for him back home. Konstantin, 33 years old. He lays in bed at night flipping through photos of his wife, Zhana, and their twin 13-year-old boys. One of the oldest soldiers is Vasily. He's 53. The soldiers call him Vasha. He takes care of the younger soldiers. He's got a 31-year-old son back home. And Vasha adopted a dog, a German Shepherd named Dina, which goes on patrol with the soldiers and lives with them in the basement. And one of the youngest soldiers is Daniel, who you all saw in the video. He's 19. And I think the most striking thing about Daniel is how completely aware he was of what the war was doing to him. He was worried that after having seen some of his friends die, and after having killed men himself, he was worried that his spirit was going to be ruined for the rest of his life at 19 years old. And I actually had the chance recently to meet up with Konstantin, who's one of the soldiers out there. Here in Kyiv, he was home for a few days to visit his sons for their 13th birthday. And we met up at a cafe in the Obolon boardwalk. It was the first time I'd seen him in a couple weeks. And we sat down at the cafe with his wife, Zhana. And just a couple minutes after meeting, his hand started to tremble. And he's like, he couldn't speak. He was trying to say something, but he couldn't get it out. So he pulled out Google Translate and started typing some things. And he said that seeing me reminded him of the war, and he was having a panic attack. And he had to step aside for a few moments to smoke a cigarette and calm down. Just a couple days before that, he took his twin sons to a water park, and as he was going down the slide, the sound of his body going over the seams in the slide, the thuds, reminded him of the artillery, and he panicked. If you want to see how real this war is, just sit and talk to a soldier who has just come back from it. And like many of the US soldiers who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, myself included, it's going to take a long time for Ukraine soldiers to feel at peace after they've come home. Before I close and take some questions, I'm going to tell one quick story, which I've told a few times in other speeches, but which I think underscores the importance of the embedded journalism program and letting the world see the truth about what's going on here in Ukraine. I mentioned last year I was in Ukraine in August and September, and I had the chance to go out to Slavyansk not too long after it was liberated. And I went out to one little village outside Slavyansk called Semyonovka. And I don't know, you've probably seen some pictures of this place. It's just completely annihilated by the artillery. I mean, places there look like Hiroshima. It's pretty awful. And with my fixer, Valentin, we walked around and we asked some of the families who had destroyed their village, who had destroyed their homes. A lot of them had been in the basements during the fighting, and they had weathered the storm, so to speak. Went to one family and they said it was the separatists. Another family said it was the Ukrainian soldiers. And I went to one family, and as we approached, the husband did this and said, DNR. So I kind of expected it was going to be an interesting conversation. And we walked up to him, and I pretended like I was French, because I speak French. And we asked him, asked the whole family, who destroyed your home? Who's responsible for this? They looked at me and they said, the American CIA bomber planes. which was a surprise to me because I was in the Air Force for more than 10 years. I wasn't aware that we were cluster bombing the Donbass. And I asked them, like, well, okay, that's interesting. Why do you think that? In my fake French accent. They told me because they saw it in the news. They saw it on TV. Russian news told them that. They were there for the battle. They were there. Russian propaganda is so powerful that people don't believe their own eyes and ears. That's scary. And that's what journalists are up against. Now, no one in the US or Europe, and the vast majority of people in Ukraine, don't think that the CIA is bombing the Donbass. But you see the effect of Russian propaganda all over Western media. Sometimes it's subtle, like calling the separatists rebels, or calling this a civil war, or saying that it hasn't been definitively proven whether a Buk missile shot down MH17, or labeling Russian involvement in the Ukraine war as an allegation by NATO, the US, and Ukraine. This is a tough war for journalists to cover. It's hard to see enough with your own eyes for any one journalist to definitively expose Russian propaganda as a lie. And to not feel professionally obligated as a journalist to include the Russian viewpoint in your stories for the sake of objectivity. But the more journalists who can go out to the front lines and see what's going on for themselves, unhindered, and with as few restrictions as practical, then the more truthfully we can tell the world what's happening here in Ukraine. So with that, thank you all, and I'm open to as many questions as you've got.
Thank you, Nolan. And I see a question over there. I'll hold it for
you. Did your experience as a military pilot help you in your reporting? Were you ever tempted to give them tips? And you went from special operations to being a reporter in special ops. You don't tell anybody anything. How did that transition work?
It's two very good questions. I think, being a pilot, I guess there's a little bit of an effect when the shooting started where I could kind of keep my cool or whatever, but I think anybody could learn to do that pretty quickly as a combat journalist. I think the biggest advantage from my prior military career was that the soldiers trusted me. When we first arrived, they did not want to talk to me. I was a foreign journalist. They didn't trust me. They all looked at me and said, CIA spion. And they didn't want to take me out into combat with them. But when I told them about my time in Iraq and Afghanistan and that I had been to war and I understood what it was like, they opened up. And by the end of the 8 weeks, they absolutely trusted me and they took me everywhere. So I think more than anything, the prior military experience is just, it's a way to gain the trust of the people you're around. As far as giving them tips or whatever, of course you're tempted to do that because you see them doing things with drones overhead that I know are incorrect. But that's a line that I don't cross as a journalist because my role is not to interfere with the war. It's just to report on it and tell the truth. It's hard because sometimes I feel like I could increase my own chances of survival by telling them things. But that's not why I'm there. And I think by doing that, I would cross a line that journalists should not cross when they're in war. You shouldn't be participating. You should only be observing. And I think that was all the questions you asked.
Special ops.
Oh, the special ops. Yeah, well, when I came home from Iraq and Afghanistan, I was amazed by the disconnect between what people thought about the wars and what was really going on. People just had no clue what our country was doing around the world. And I think it's really important in a democracy, whether in the United States or here in Ukraine, for the citizens and the people to know what their country is doing, what their military is doing. It's a critical role for journalists, and it helps keep the government accountable. And so that's what led me, even though you're right, it was always beaten in my head to not talk to journalists and to keep everything secret. But I think there is a role and an importance to letting people know the truth about what was going on.
Thank you.
Thank you that you come to us. I'm originally from Donetsk, so I want to thank you that you really show that it's no peacetime, it's still artillery bombs, and you can see that, but that artillery bombs from civilians districts, they use civilians like hostages. And I want to ask you about another thing. I read a lot of analytics, and all the people say that the war will finish soon, maybe in December, before New Year. And what do you think about that? You was there, you see that. How you feel that? Do you think it's real to finish in 6 months or less?
That's. I wish I knew the answer to that question. It didn't feel out there. I mean, just based on the amount of weapons being fired every day, it didn't feel like things were slowing down. I mean, I think just 1 or 2 days ago, eight Ukrainian soldiers were killed in one day. So I don't know. That's the best answer. I think the world is so complicated right now between things in Iran and ISIS and Russia. And you never know how things are going to play out around the world to influence what happens here in Ukraine. But I definitely think that things have become a lot more dangerous than they were a year ago, because the United States and NATO have repositioned into eastern Ukraine. And I think the greatest risk is a misunderstanding between Russia and the United States, some military exercise that wasn't conveyed to the other side, or 2 fighter jets bumping into each other and starting a war. So I don't know. I don't know if Russia would escalate things here, but I think there's a great risk of things accidentally getting much worse based on a miscalculation by somebody.
Thank you. More questions?
There are videos on your website about Afghanistan, about Ukraine, and about Iraq, as far as I remember. And the Ukrainian video is the most violent, the most harsh. Nothing to compare about Afghanistan and Iraq footage that you made. From your experience, what do you think is the Ukrainian conflict involves more violent to human on the human level than another conflicts you've been to, and what are the differences and the similarities between them?
Absolutely, the Ukraine war is more violent. Like I said in my talk, the war it's geographically contained to the front lines, whereas in Iraq and Afghanistan you could go to basically any village and feel like the war is there. Whereas here in Ukraine, the war is more of a destination; it's a place. And so in that way, I guess the war is a little bit less intense. But when you're on the front lines, I mean, it feels like you're running around Saving Private Ryan or something. It's a type of warfare that the U.S. military hasn't been involved in since maybe Vietnam or Korea. Heavy artillery, tanks. In Pesky, there were tanks shooting at each other almost every day. And this is 2015 in Europe. You got World War II type combat going on, or trench warfare. I mean, it's crazy. I never saw anything like that in Iraq and Afghanistan. Go ahead.
Was it easier for you to observe the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Was it easier to observe?
Yeah, psychologically.
I think maybe perhaps in a way, because I had fought in Iraq and Afghanistan as a soldier. So when I went back to Afghanistan as a journalist, I was familiar with the war. But it was also a much greater challenge to be objective, because it's very hard to be objective about your own country's soldiers. Similarly, it's very hard to be objective here in Ukraine when it's hard to be objective about the people who are trying to kill you. But I think you have to strive to do that. But yeah, I think the war here is much more intense. Definitely.
After your experience, what's your personal opinion on the subject of lethal weapons? Should it be provided to Ukraine or it would escalate?
That's a very, very tough question. When you're out there, I mean, my gut reaction is, yeah, let's give them all the weapons that we can give them. But when you step back, I don't know. Would that escalate the war? Maybe, maybe not. That's a huge risk that I think our leaders are going to have to weigh. I do have to say that, like I mentioned in my talk, that it wasn't necessarily weapons that Ukraine needs the most. More than anything, it's training. It's things like drones. It's more advanced technology to target their artillery, night vision goggles, better scopes for their rifles. I think those are the things, even speaking with the soldiers, that they need more than more guns and more ammunition and more missiles. Because Ukraine is pretty well capable of producing all the weapons that it needs for this conflict. It's those other things, those more high-end technological things that I think would make a big difference for the Ukrainian side. And I think the US could supply those without running the risk of significantly escalating the lethality of the war.
Thank you. Questions?
Can you speak more about objectivity? Like how and why are you trying to be objective when it's so clear that from the Russian side there are so many lies? And what is there to do about it?
Well, I think one thing you have to be very careful of when you know that the Russian propaganda is all, I mean, it's just blatantly false. You have to be very careful about not doing your reporting as a response to the Russian propaganda. I'm not trying to give a rebuttal to what Moscow is saying. I'm just trying to give the truth. That's all. I don't think about what everybody else is saying. I don't think about what Sputnik News or RT is saying when I write my stories. Because I feel like if you do that, you're tempted to counter propaganda with propaganda. And that's not the right thing to do. Journalists are not soldiers. We're there to observe and tell the truth. But it's hard. It's so hard. It was hard for me when I was back in Afghanistan with American soldiers. And it's hard in Ukraine. Like I mentioned, after a few days, these soldiers took me in. And after a while, it kind of became obvious that the snipers were trying to specifically kill me because I had press written all over me. And that's true. They try and get the press guys first. And this made the Ukrainian soldiers angry. And so a lot of times when the snipers would start shooting, the Ukrainians would actually, Vasha, the 53-year-old in particular, he would put himself between me and the sniper, putting his body like a Secret Service agent for the president or something. He was willing to put his body in the way of a bullet for me. So after that, I mean, how do you be objective about that? It's almost impossible. And so what I always tell people is that truth and objectivity are not necessarily the same things. If you're truly objective, then I will include the Russian side in every story I write. But when you see the truth, you know that's a lie. So anyway, I think the antidote to that objectivity question is just to tell the truth always and just stick to the facts.
Thank you. We have a question here.
One of the topics that comes up in news reporting, it's a continuing issue, is about the relationship between the National Army and the militias. So like Red Sector and Azov and these brigades, etc. Did you have any occasion to, speak to some of those soldiers, or at least maybe get anecdotes or opinions from the national army members, in terms of the relationship there, if there's, you know, incredible dysfunction that has anything to do with the, you know, lack of success, or
That's a great question, because it's been a big transition in the last 6 months. In Pesky, in particular, it is only the 93rd Brigade out there, the regular army. Back months ago, the Ukrainian units there were a hodgepodge of National Guard and civilian volunteer battalions. But all the volunteer battalions that were in Pesky have now been brought into the regular army. They've been incorporated into the regular army as just different units. So OUN was out there, Karpatska Sich, and other units. And so now they are actually officially part of the regular army. And if you go out to Shirokina down in Mariupol, groups like Azov have become National Guard battalions. Shirokina is a little different because the National Guard units, the battalions, they operate pretty much as distinct units in coordination with other units out there, like the regular army or other National Guard elements. Whereas in Pesky, they're all under one command. They're all under the regular army command. I didn't see any dysfunction between the units. I think communication is always a challenge between different units. I think one of the big challenges they have is they don't have encrypted communications. So they share the airwaves with the separatists, which is a really big problem. They actually, in some places, they use runners, like World War I style, where they have to send a guy to run out to the trenches to give a message because they can't use it. They can't transmit it over the radio. Yeah, so that's a big problem. But I haven't seen any big butting of heads between the different elements. They all seem to be relatively well coordinated and working together.
Thank you. How you can characterize Ukrainian soldiers? They said that the Ukrainian army destroyed and unreliable. I mean, you narrate about Vasily, which shows the protective reflex to you. Have you ever seen these qualities any, except Ukraine? And what do you think about this? Is it natural for military men?
Well, I think, when I was among American soldiers in times of war, you develop a comradeship and friendships and bonds that are pretty incredible. So I've seen things like that with American soldiers. But the soldiers in Ukraine, they, like I mentioned, they had a will to fight. They behaved very well in combat. They knew what to do. I think they need more specific training, more specific combat training about how to use weapons and things like that. But I was really impressed with their behavior and their demeanor in combat. I only saw one soldier out there in the 8 days have to be taken off the line because of a psychological problem, that he couldn't handle the stress of the combat. And that's pretty good because it was really stressful. Very scary. And he voluntarily left too. He said, I need 5 days off, and they took him off the line. So yeah, the propaganda lines you hear about mass desertions and the soldiers refusing to fight and stuff like that. I've never seen that with my own eyes out there. Quite the opposite, actually.
Okay.
Have you encountered at all any foreign journalists reporting from the side of the separatists? I'm from the UK, and obviously we hear a lot from Graham Phillips, who's not really a journalist. But have you encountered anyone like that from the other side and spoken to them about the motivations?
Yeah, I've definitely talked to a lot of journalists who've been in Donetsk and who have been out with the separatists. They all kind of say tongue-in-cheek, yeah, the Russians are there, but they don't wear their patches on their uniforms. I think it's, one question I get a lot from people is whether I'm going to go over to the separatists now and try to report on that side to be fair. And I say no, because I've seen way too much on the Ukrainian side now that I'd be such a liability to the Ukrainian army if I was captured or interrogated by the separatists. I know where all their positions are, where the tanks are hidden and all that. so I can't. And I also know it's not the responsibility of one journalist to tell every side of a story in a war. That's why you have more than one journalist here, because you can get all those different sides without having to rely on one voice to do it. But I think it is important to have people on both sides of the lines to show what's going on. As far as like the character of the separatists, I haven't seen it firsthand, so I would just be relying on other people's opinions to comment on that.
In your speech, you mentioned that those brave guys, Ukrainian soldiers, they morally can't stay alone for long like this. What do you feel they need? Like, I mean, from the state, another right from the state to do. I mean, to continue on with the attack, with the fire, with the war. What would be the best outcome for them at this point, from your feeling, from being there?
Well, I know in their minds, in their warrior spirit, they want to attack. They want to get those territories back. Now, that's not the political answer. I don't know what's best for Ukraine as a country. But I think it's not sustainable to keep 60,000 soldiers in the ATO under artillery fire every day indefinitely. Ukraine can't afford that. And the army, I mean, eventually, despite the morale of the troops, eventually that's going to wear people down. And I think Ukraine's going to have a big problem coming up with post-traumatic stress among these soldiers. I think that's going to be something our United States has had to deal with. That it's been a big issue. We've actually lost more soldiers to suicide than we have in combat. And anecdotally, I hear that suicides are becoming a problem among the returning soldiers here in Ukraine. So I think something has to change. And you listen what the soldiers say, but there's also, we have to think about what's best for the country. And so I hope that when a decision is made, that it is one that the army and the politicians are in agreement over.
Thank you. We have more questions. Prospectively, do you plan to take part in trainings for soldiers or for journalists? As well, you have a great experience in that, and you say that your principal thing is to observe, but you can also contribute a lot. So I just like to know whether this is what you're planning to do or not.
Yeah, like I said, I probably could do a lot of good as a trainer, but I also think I'd be crossing the line as a journalist. And I think my role here is not to help Ukraine win this war. I'm not a soldier. My role here is just to tell the truth about what's going on, because I feel like that is the best thing I can do.
I meant training for journalists, actually.
Oh, training for journalists. Okay. Yeah, I think it would be a great idea to train journalists, because one very unfortunate part of the news media today is that most outlets don't spend the money to send people to cover these wars for long periods of time. Like, I've been here for more than 6 months total now, but most people are freelancers who come in here for a month or a few weeks, maybe 22, 24 years old with no experience in combat, and they buy a helmet and a vest and they hitch a ride to the front lines, and they don't know when to duck or run, or it's really dangerous. So yes, I think that's really, really important to train journalists to know how to at least be safe and to not be a liability in combat. And most importantly, to learn how to take care of themselves if they get injured, so that the soldiers don't have to take care of them.
So you've made a lot of comparisons between Ukraine and then Iraq and Afghanistan. So one big part of American operations in Iraq and Afghanistan was the Hearts and Minds campaign and trying to win people over. Have you seen much of that in Ukraine? Is there even like psyops or information war or anything along those lines to win over that one guy who held up his fist and said DNR? Like, is there any attempt to bring him over, like a concerted attempt, like a purposeful attempt?
I think the examples of that I've seen have been in places behind the Ukrainian lines, so in territory that Ukraine controls. I think what makes it really hard here is it's a frontal war. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we kind of controlled everything. You could go to any city and, you know, you could put out flyers or hold town hall meetings or do shuras with the local elders. But Ukraine, they have practically no access to the people living under separatist control right now. And those people living there are bombarded with Russian propaganda. So if there is some sort of effort to change the opinions of people there, it's going to be an uphill struggle for Ukraine. I do think that you could say that this embed program is, in a way, a PSYOPs program, because the Ukrainian military, for the first time, realized that countering Russian propaganda with their own spin is not the most effective way to get their message out. And it took a leap of faith for the Ukrainian military to allow foreign journalists like me to go in bed with their troops and to have complete access and complete liberty to report on whatever I wanted. They didn't ask to see a single photo or video when I got back. I could report on whatever I wanted. And the only gentleman's agreement was just shaking hands, and I said, I will not publish anything that reveals sensitive information, like where things are hidden or disclosing where the troops are living, things like that. So I think, yeah, there is a PSYOPs component, a psychological, or, you know, not propaganda, but trying to control the message and change people's hearts and minds. But I think the effort in Ukraine is more geared toward the rest of the world, more geared towards Europe and the United States, rather than the people living under separatist control, because they're under pretty tight, control with Russian propaganda right now. And I don't know how Ukraine could break that.
After you spend some time with soldiers, in your opinion, what can be useful or helpful for them to be whom they were after ATO? Like, a lot of them don't want to speak to anyone. A lot of them want to be close, like to.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think America is still trying to figure that out too. There's a big divide between civilian and military culture that I think exists here in Ukraine, just like it does back home in the United States. There's a few groups actually that have sprouted up in Ukraine based on things that America has done in our wars. One of them is Wounded Warrior Ukraine, which is actually doing a great job. And they're training soldiers, medics, in how to treat soldiers when they come back. So we give them counseling, tell them how, you know, that these things are normal, that to feel those panic attacks and to have, you know, maybe flashbacks, or to feel, you know, the emotional fluctuations and then the depression. They teach them that that's normal, and they teach them how to work through that. So I think, you know, the best solution that I know of is to just not let the soldiers be alone. Because one of the hardest parts about leaving the military and rejoining your life is that you lose that brotherhood, that comradeship. You know, you live out there in combat with these guys, and it's a family, and it's a family that's tighter and more well-connected than any family you've had before. Probably even more tightly connected than your real family back home. And so when you go back home, you lose that, and it leaves a lot of soldiers feeling very alone, and they feel like they can't share their experiences to anybody else because they just won't understand. I mean, it's impossible to show a video and to tell you all what it feels like inside of you when you have a sniper shooting at you, or when the artillery is coming. It's hard to put that into words. And so soldiers feel like they feel like there's a barrier between them and the people back home. So I think, you know, counseling and not letting the soldiers just kind of disappear into the sunset when they get back, but keeping them engaged. You know, America has a lot of groups like Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, where they, you know, veterans can sit around in a bar and talk old stories and still hang out and, you know, play football or whatever. So things like that, I think, will help the soldiers in Ukraine too.
We can take one more question.
said much about soldiers who suffer from stress, but I'd like to ask you about other people who also face up all the situation. Now this winter I worked in a hotel at the reception, and I had an opportunity to speak to some people who stayed at that hotel. They came from Donetsk, and one woman said that she was really scared, but she only heard tanks shooting in some streets of the city, but she didn't even see it by her own eyes. And she was sure in nothing, because she understood that she can lose her home and she can lose her son who stayed there. But she didn't take part in that war. So what could you say just to calm such people if your expectations about this war are so pessimistic? Which advice could you give them?
You're right that the war definitely affects a lot more people than just the soldiers. I was just in Mariupol last week, and I walked around and I met a young woman, 23 years old. She told me she didn't want to get married and have kids because she was so uncertain about what things were going to be like in Mariupol 6 months or a year from now. So it's hard, I think, and for a lot of people, they feel like their lives are on hold in Ukraine. And I have friends who tell me that, they can't sleep at night because they live here in Kyiv and they have nothing to do with the military, but they can't sleep because they feel so panicked about the war and what's going on in their country. So I don't know. I think, there's, for the people who have been affected by the war and have lost their homes, and it's a tragedy. And I think the best thing that the country can do is just to not forget about them, to not turn away and pretend like the war isn't going on. And I think for me, when I came back and I shared my stories, some of the people who were the most surprised about what was happening in the East, about the fighting that I saw, were Ukrainians. And I talked to a lot of Ukrainians, and they had no idea that things were still like that out there. So I think it's important for the whole country to remember what's happening and to help those people when they need them. I know there's a lot of people in Kyiv who've taken in refugees from the East. So I think it's something that the country can do to rally together and to help people. And I think, I tell you, after seeing the volunteer movement and seeing what the civilian volunteers do to help the soldiers, I think that's definitely in the character of the Ukrainian people to get through this and to get through it stronger than they were beforehand.
Thank you, Nolan, and please join me in thanking Nolan for his presentation.